This is House Planning Help, episode 11.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future, build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith. And in this session, my guest is Dr. Brenda Boardman from the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford. We look at fuel poverty and how it should impact on the homes we build. And it's the last episode of 2012. So, what is the biggest breakthrough that I feel I've made in my research so far?
HousePlanningHelp.com.
Welcome, thank you for downloading. And we start today with a knock at my front door. And when I went down to open the door, it was a representative of Transition Hartford, a guy named Ray. Transition is a network which you may or may not have heard about. I think it spreads all the way around the world now, or certainly in a lot of countries. But it's people who want to do their bit to try and avoid climate change, help energy efficiency. So it tied in quite nicely with what I'm doing. And when Ray said, "Would you like an energy assessment of my house?" I thought, well, actually, let's see if there's anything I'm missing according to the knowledge that you have. So I invited him in and he did his reports. We looked at some of the issues. One of them, I might have said this before, how the back of my house, there is an extension, a single-storey extension that is quite dodgy. The guy who put it in, I don't know, I think he was a DIY enthusiast who perhaps had a little bit more to learn. And so the door is hanging at a weird angle, which I'd never noticed before. And that could be why there's a lot of air leakage through that door. So this was one really good recommendation that they had, that perhaps I should just get a draft strip and put it down there and stop. You can actually see from the inside to the outside a visible air gap, which I imagine is very bad and probably what's making the back of the house feel so cold. But we always seem to have our issues there. The other thing was he lent me an energy monitor, which I still have in the house, and it's been something to keep my eye on when you're using gadgets, whether it's the computer that's on or the television or the kettle, which you know is going to be a bad item, using about 3 kilowatts as it goes along. But the one that surprised me was the dishwasher, particularly because it's got this great button on it that says Eco. So you push the Eco button and just assume, oh, well, it's okay, I've pressed the Eco button, I'll be all right. But that was using about 2 kilowatts for the first half an hour, maybe longer than that. I didn't keep an eye on it, but I was surprised, thinking, what on earth is using that power? And of course it was the dishwasher. But I thought this linked in quite nicely with our main content today with Dr. Brenda Boardman. As I record this interview, fuel poverty is hitting the headlines in the UK, and you may think that it has nothing to do with you as someone who wants to build or renovate, but I believe it's time that we realise we each have our part to play.
HousePlanningHelp.com. The interview.
I'm with Dr. Brenda Boardman here at the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford. Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
And I think this will be fascinating for a lot of people, but I've just found that it's got to the point in my research where I need to ask some bigger questions. It is all about house building and trying to get that energy efficient home, but I have some wider questions. Before we go there, though, I want to know a little bit about you, and hopefully you can tell others how your career path has gone and some of the amazing literature that you have written and where you feel things have gone.
Right, well, I've been here at the University of Oxford since 1991, always in the Environmental Change Institute. My academic career has always focused on reducing the demand for energy in the home, and that's electricity and gas, and it's particularly focused on the UK because I don't think we should be entering into international agreements unless we got our own house in order. So I have focused on the UK, and I've also done it within the context of Europe because despite what some politicians say, an amazing amount of our environmental legislation actually starts in Brussels, and we wouldn't be anywhere near as good on energy efficiency and environmental issues in the UK if it wasn't for Brussels. How did I get here in 1991? I have a very odd trajectory, which I will sketch in for you. I actually started my first degree at the age of 30, and I did it through correspondence courses at the Open University. So I'm an Open University graduate. That took me 9 years. By the time I'd finished that degree, I had a husband and 2 children and was living in East Sussex in Lewes. And the very prestigious Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex was just along the road. So I went to them and I said, look, I'm 40. I want to do more research on this topic, which is the energy efficiency in low-income households. It had got focused on low-income households by them. And in the end, they accepted me. So I did my doctorate at SPRU at Sussex, and that was 1983 to 1988. I then made my doctorate into a book called Fuel Poverty, From Cold Homes to Affordable Warmth. And then in 1991, there was this job advertised at St Hilda's College, sponsored by Powergen, and I got it, and here I am.
So you will have seen a lot of change. You will have written about it, first of all, and then seen the direction that things have gone. How are we doing?
We're not doing at all well in the UK. I would stress that I've been fortunate to have an interdisciplinary brain, which means, in the simplest of terms, I like words and numbers, and have always looked at issues in a very overview sense, helicopter view type sense. So I do a bit of economics, I do quite a bit of policy, do the sociology, do the technology, try and understand what it is you and I have to cope with on a daily basis, rather than subdividing it into lots of little disciplines. In some ways we're doing well, because when I started, the subject of fuel poverty was definitely not on the political agenda. The Thatcher government refused to even utter the words. It couldn't exist. There wasn't peanut poverty, so why was there fuel poverty? Fortunately, the Labour government, when they came in 1997, did understand the issues and accepted fuel poverty right from the beginning, which is brilliant. And just for your listeners, the real difference between poverty and fuel poverty, and it applies to everything to do with energy, which is often forgotten. When you use energy, you actually have to have a piece of capital equipment to turn that energy into the service you want. Now, that could be a car, it could be a light bulb, it could be a house, it could be a boiler, a cooker, it doesn't matter. But the role of capital equipment and expenditure on capital equipment in fuel poverty is crucial for differentiating it between ordinary poverty and fuel poverty. You can cure poverty by giving people more income. You cannot sensibly cure fuel poverty by doing that, because it just recurs and recurs and recurs. Whereas a one-off big capital investment in energy efficiency could take somebody out of fuel poverty. So my doctoral research and my first book and a lot of my subsequent research, although sometimes intermittently, has focused on a social problem which has its foundation in energy inefficient homes. And what I've done subsequently is add in the whole climate change agenda. And again, originally there was a debate, should we focus on fuel poverty or should we focus on climate change? Well, actually, we need to do both at the same time. There's lots of synergies, and there's some real problems if you don't bring the two together. So in terms of fuel poverty, Britain has some good targets, but absolutely no government commitment to achieving them, which is really a bit heartbreaking. In terms of the energy efficiency of our housing stock, I think it would probably be true to say that we've still got some of the worst in Europe. Even though we've had programmes since 1976, we haven't actually made a substantial amount of difference.
Now, I went to an eco home from 1981 a few weeks ago. I didn't know at the time about the Home World exhibition. I imagine you, of course, will know about it in Milton Keynes. But it just struck me as funny that they had a lot of the answers. And I know, having spoken to Dr. Wolfgang Feist as well and had a few episodes, we seem to know how we can reduce the energy. So what has been stopping us over the last 30, 40 years?
It's absolutely not the technology. You're absolutely right on that. We know what to do. We know how to do it. We just don't do it. And that's a failure of government and people's lifestyles to come together. I think we've made quite a big mistake in the past at just looking at the amount of running costs that a energy efficiency measure, a boiler or insulation, would save. And increasingly, those don't justify the expenditure. So you could justify loft insulation or cavity wall insulation because it'll save you usually some gas. But if you start looking at solid wall insulation, it's much more difficult. And this comes back again to my running costs versus capital issue. I think if we, as a society, valued energy efficient buildings, and I mean value in the monetary sense, if we really valued them so that an A or B rated property was worth quite a lot more than an F or G rated property, those are the bands on the energy performance certificate, then putting money into your home would have a double benefit. It will save you costs, running costs, and it will increase the value of the property. And I think we've made a big mistake ignoring that aspect of energy efficiency so far, and it's one of the things that I've been promoting in my most recent publication, Achieving Zero.
Is it a marketing problem? Let's say we build them as low running cost houses, something like that, and just forgot about the eco side, because sometimes people, they're just not interested. And so you effectively give them an eco house, but you call it something else that will tempt them in. Is that evil of me?
No, it's not evil of you, but I really don't know the answer. I think it is probable that different people in the population will respond to different messages. That some people will respond to being green and helping the planet. Some people will respond to reducing their running costs. Some people will just respond because it's a much nicer environment inside. You don't have cold patches. You do have a really comfortable environment. You don't have rooms you can't use in winter. It's just better. And some people will respond, as I say, perhaps because they think it adds value to the property, and it does. So I think there are all sorts of different reasons why people respond. One of the other aspects about emphasising the impact on the value of the property is that at the moment, if you've got a house with a cavity that's not filled, why should you do it? There's no sort of deadline. There's no absolute requirement. Nobody can see whether you've done it. You might be a bit warmer. You might actually think you'd rather spend the money on a summer holiday. There's just what sociologists call agency. This agency enables you to complete the circle. And my best example of agency is what's happened, certainly in North Oxford and lots of other places, over recycling. It used to be that you could have a plastic bag in your sitting room and you filled it up and occasionally you put it in the boot of the car and you took it off somewhere. And that was all a bit messy and a bit of a hassle and not terribly satisfactory. You could get a bit of a warm glow, but not a big one. Now we've got blue boxes, green boxes, brown bags, all sorts of things. And not only are you encouraged to fill them up, they don't have to sit in your sitting room. They can sit out on your doorstep. And somebody comes and takes them away and empties them for you. And so the whole thing is now a very neat, complete circle. It's made easy for you to recycle. And we don't have anything like that with our homes. We don't have anything that makes it really easy to do the insulation, the energy efficiency improvement. There's no guidelines as to what standard to try and achieve. It is, as I say, open-ended.
Well, you mentioned the word standard there, and I'd be very interested to know your views on the passive house standard, because that is creating a very narrow target. And I know that a lot of people feel that we need to have that narrow target, really. What is your opinion? If we just continue as we are, where are we going to end up?
I think I'm going to give you a long answer to that question. Okay. When I started doing Achieving Zero, this is looking at how to get all energy use in all buildings in the UK to result in zero carbon emissions by 2050. That actually is part of our legislative obligation. Under the Climate Change Act, people talk about 80% on greenhouse gases, but actually when you get down to CO2 and buildings, it's virtually 100%. The government and the Committee on Climate Change both think that this will result from you and I switching to electric heating and using heat pumps, whether air source or ground source, and B, building a lot more nuclear and power stations and putting carbon capture and storage on other power stations so that we've got the decarbonisation of the electricity industry. Well, I don't actually like or agree with either of those assumptions. And that became very clear to me with writing Achieving Zero. So I got to the stage of thinking, well, I don't think we're going to be able to do it through the decarbonisation of the electricity industry. I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen fast enough. And if it did happen, it might be extraordinarily expensive, the resultant electricity, and therefore not good for the fuel poor. So I don't like that approach. And what I'm trying to do is reduce the costs for all of us, and especially for the fuel poor, who are often cold. And if you do energy efficiency, you don't put up the prices for the fuel poor because you're not building more power stations that are expensive. You reduce the costs. The price may still be high per unit, but you've reduced the cost because you've reduced the need to buy so much gas or so much electricity. So, having rejected the government's opinion on these things, I then end up with thinking, okay, I want super efficient homes. I don't want to do it through the supply side. I want to do it through demand reduction. Just what can be achieved. And actually, with Achieving Zero, my proposal is that every house and every building in the UK is Passive House Standard by 2050. I have eradicated the need for any heating systems. There are a few wood stoves, there are a few little bits of underfloor electric heating or electric heaters on the intake of your air for your mechanical heat recovery. But basically, there's no heating systems. So looking at the very big picture of where we've got to be, where we, the UK as a whole, as an economy and society, have got to be by 2050, I ended up with Passive House for everybody.
That's interesting. Just before I move on a little bit further, can I ask about 2050, and is this just something that's been plucked out of the air?
Oh no. Most of the climate scientists are absolutely horrified at how little the world is doing to reduce carbon emissions. We know that we want to try and keep climate change, global warming, to 2 degrees centigrade increase over the industrial revolution level. There's almost no chance that we can achieve that now. And we're heading for 3 and 4 degrees. And 4 degrees warmer is perceived to be risking catastrophe. Really nasty extreme weather in really unusual places, just the sort of extreme weather we've been getting with winter droughts and flooded summers and heat waves in Russia and droughts in America, melting of the Arctic ice cap much too quickly. All of these things could be just indicators of the sort of climate we're creating for ourselves. Because bear in mind, there's almost no such thing as natural weather anymore. It's all what we are forcing on ourselves. So if we don't like it, we know who to blame. Anyway, coming back to 2050. It is absolutely brilliant that the British government has accepted this hugely challenging target. They probably don't quite realise how challenging it is. And sometimes politicians being a little bit ignorant is useful. But it is a fantastic example about what a country is trying to do. It's a very important lever with Europe. Europe has got some challenging targets, particularly for 2020, which is, after all, only 7 years away. One of the most challenging is that for the UK, 15% of our energy, all energy, whether it's oil, gas, electricity, whatever it is, 15% of it should come from renewable sources by 2020. And we are nowhere near that target. That's a really, really difficult one. And the British government, that's you and me as taxpayers, have to pay quite hefty fines every year that we miss it. So that's not good. So the whole set of targets, the 2020s, the 2030s, the 2050s, etc., are absolutely spot on, if not unambitious enough. But the policies and people's perspectives aren't yet delivering them.
I've had a few conversations with people where they've almost done a bit of scaremongering and predicted doom for the world. But what is the energy situation? If we wanted to just keep on using fossil fuels, how long would it go on for? Or would we reach a stage where the prices are too high, back to fuel poverty again, I suppose?
The reality is that we shouldn't use these fossil fuels for climate change purposes. Something, I'm not good on the actual numbers, but something in the region of a quarter of the oil, gas and coal that we know about can we afford as a world to use.
For the climate?
For the climate. Nothing to do with price, just for the climate. And the implications of changing the climate, as Lord Stern proved, could be hugely expensive and disruptive. So we might be worried about, it's all this running costs versus capital costs again. We might all be worried about the price of our energy in future, whereas actually what we've got to be worried about is the effect of the climate on our infrastructure, our lifestyles, our choices. You know, how many buildings are going to be flooded? What's going to be the rate of sea level rise?
But you think we can avoid that still?
Well, I'm a born optimist, don't forget, Ben. And a bit of me horribly realises just how difficult what I am suggesting is. But sometimes you can be quite positive about this. I mean, one of the reasons I like the Passive House Standard is because I have more faith in its modelling and algorithms than I do in the standard assessment procedure, which we use for our energy performance certificates, etc. But anyway, just dealing with the standard assessment procedure, SAP, over the last, I think it's something like 30 or 40 years, if you go back, we have improved the energy efficiency of our housing stock by 1 SAP point per annum. And the average now, the maximum's 100, and the average now in England is about 54. So that means by 2050, I think we should all be 100, SAP of 100. I think we should all be A-rated, emitting zero carbon from what our lifestyles are in the home. So if we've got to get to 100 from 54, that's 46 points in 38 years. It's not much faster than 1 SAP point per annum. It isn't impossible to imagine we could do it. So my brain is quite schizophrenic about this. At times I'm optimistic because we could do it, we must do it. And other times I'm totally pessimistic because of how little we're actually achieving.
I think it is getting to the point, though, it's a crunch point and it's not that far off. And throughout history, people have got up and reacted to that and have managed to get over anything that has been really challenging society. And I think we're getting close now. Taking a look at your book for a moment here, Achieving Zero, Delivering Future-Friendly Buildings, what would be in that for, say, for example, people listening at the moment wanting to build their own house or to retrofit their own house?
Well, I think the first thing to do is, if you like, pretend, if not accept, that you are going to get it to an A-rated building. This is especially true of retrofit. And then think, okay, how many attempts am I going to have to do that? Am I going to do it room by room? Am I going to do nothing for 5 years, then move out for 6 months and do the whole lot? What's the trajectory for this building to get it from where it is now up to an A-rated property over the next 38 years? And I mean, that's where it's so much easier if you build a brand new. You aren't in the building, you aren't being messed around, you haven't got to move out somewhere temporarily, you haven't got to disrupt the kids' schooling or whatever it is. And it's all done within one go. So that is all brilliant. I think retrofitting is more difficult, and I'm actually going to a meeting this afternoon discussing the pros and cons of one big retrofit versus lots of incremental retrofits. And I suspect that lots of the little incremental retrofits, like you're doing the kitchen, so you do internal wall insulation on the kitchen at the same time. And then that causes all sorts of problems about the junction with the floor, the junction with the ceiling, the junction with the adjoining rooms. And I suspect that the skills we have in society are even less good at some of those awkward junctions. We don't have masses of skills in terms of delivering A-rated homes, but I think that's demanding even more.
But starting maybe with the new builds, not all of the new builds are passive house standard.
No. And I just
Fraction of them.
Yes, I know. And there's a further problem about designed versus delivered, that we're not very good at building the properties that we do build, the new ones we build, to the standard that is in the architect's drawings. Increasingly, I hope, we're going to be moving towards standards based on the property as built, just as passive house requires you to do an air test, air change per hour test, air leakage test, after it's built. There is discussion now within the government and about what the Zero Carbon Hub have proposed, which is a slightly lower standard than was originally being promoted by the Code for Sustainable Homes 6. They've got a lower standard than that. On the other hand, they're going to make it tougher because it's the as-built standard, not the as-designed. So that will start getting our builders to be more aware of the issues and more able to deliver. But I just want to step back a wee bit. And whether you're talking about retrofit or new build, I just want to highlight the difference between gas use and electricity use as we conventionally employ them in this country. Most of SAP is actually based on gas usage. When we talk about an energy efficient home, we normally mean better insulation, better boiler, reducing gas use. Now, it is absolutely correct that 85% of our energy, measured as energy, is gas use, and the other 15% is electricity. But because electricity is both carbon intensive and expensive, on peak electricity, because that's what we're usually using in our lights and appliances, if you look at expenditure or carbon, it's about the same. Something in the region of nearly half of the carbon and nearly half of the expenditure goes on electricity. And that's another reason why I like the passive house. It does include all those ancillary uses of energy in one of its measurements. I don't think it's anywhere near tough enough. I think it actually allows us to have too many pieces of equipment and inefficient light bulbs, well, semi-efficient CFLs rather than LEDs, that sort of thing. So I would like the passive house energy standard, as opposed to heating standard, to be toughened. If you are really looking at a zero carbon house, you've got to look at the way you use electricity. You know, have you got A-rated appliances, etc., etc.
Well, it's been a fascinating chat that we've had today. Thank you very much for that. But is there a closing thought, something that you want to leave in our minds?
Just continuing with the theme of all energy and not just gas. I'd like everybody to be a little bit more politically active. When was the last focus on the environment in any general election or local authority election? How much does the government really know about what you and I are concerned about? Are we actually hidden from policies and politics? So, for instance, just recently, the government, I think it is for the third time, has refused to pass any legislation on what's called consequential improvements. so that if you extend your house, build a conservatory or whatever, you don't have to worry about the impact on the rest of the building. Whereas if we had employed consequential improvements, we would have made it so that even with the extension, even though that is low carbon, low energy, the total impact on the whole house would be lower consumption. And we haven't done that. And I think that's because politicians are too worried about the Daily Mail headlines, which means you and I are seen to be the fringe and not seen to be the future. And it would be very nice if we could start changing that.
Dr. Boardman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an interesting discussion, more to take on board, and you'll find the show notes for this episode at houseplanninghelp.com/11. Thank you to one of my previous guests, Alex Rice from Green Tomato Energy, for suggesting that I interview Dr. Boardman. It was a very good recommendation. Thank you, Alex. So I'm 5 months into my research, and earlier I said that I would reveal the biggest breakthrough that I feel I have made to date. And it's probably not what you think, because for me, the energy efficiency side, I've always understood. To me, it's common sense. But I do still struggle a little bit with the aesthetics of modern architecture. But as I've gone along, I feel I'm learning. I'm understanding why you might want to do these things. So when we look at modern architecture, when it's done well, it really does take advantage of light, of space. It harnesses the sun as a free heating source. It doesn't overheat because you're shading it in the right way. The materials are chosen because they don't have much impact on the environment. It's the best choice of those materials. So whereas a traditional way might have been the best way that they were thinking back then, we are using our best thinking in our best buildings now. I think that makes sense. But for me, that's quite a breakthrough. I'm not saying that I don't still love the traditional, because I do, and I would really want to try and find out, what did they get right? What was right that we can use in our buildings today from the past, but also do the best with the knowledge that we have around? That's what I haven't sussed yet, but there's always next year for the podcast. If you do like podcasts, you might enjoy hearing me as a guest. I won't be asking the questions this time, but I appear on an episode of the Construction Industry podcast, and I'll put that in the show notes. It's episode 36 of their podcast. I chat to Caesar Abeid, so you can download that and have a listen. And next time, in our first podcast of 2013, we get an introduction to renewable energy. This is with Dr. Derek Taylor from All Technica. He's also a lecturer at the Open University. So until next time, take care.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.